Hello and welcome to App Threat Intelligence and Defense for Mobile Devices by Marble Security. My name's Dave Jevons and I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Marble. The operating systems on iPhones, iPads, and on Android are much more secure than the old legacy operating systems we're used to on Windows and even macOS devices. We've got sandboxing. We've got a much more controlled walled garden about what types of apps are available on these systems. The real threat in the mobile environment is not so much operating system attacks like it has been with legacy PC-based systems. The real threat are the millions of apps and hundreds of thousands of app publishers who are publishing apps on all these devices. The threat is privacy leaks, both at the consumer level and at the enterprise level. Malicious apps that are doing surveillance against companies in the guise of a game or a dating app. In fact, Gartner research has published that 75% of all mobile security breaches will be through apps for the next several years. Marble Security has analyzed over 3 million apps on Android and iOS, and we publish security reports about once a quarter illustrating new findings, new metrics, new methodologies for determining apps that can pose a risk to the enterprise. What we find is that an app that might be a problem for a consumer, it's exposing personal data, it's selling data, well, that's a personal problem. When brought into an enterprise context, that can be a major security breach, a breach that can result in advanced persistent threats and targeted spear phishing, or a compliance issue where healthcare information, protected customer information is being leaked. In one of our reports, we looked across over 1 million apps on Android and iOS and applied a risk scoring methodology to see which apps posed most risk to an enterprise and which categories they fall in. The results are quite interesting. We found that on Android, predictably, about 18% of social networking apps posed a fairly high risk to the exposure of personal and corporate information, including address books, contacts, calendar information, and potentially credentials or access to cloud-based services. Following that were productivity apps and business apps. The story's a little different on iOS. Some of this is due to the fact that iOS does have a more restrictive capabilities model than Android, meaning that apps can't, for example, read your SMS messages or your call logs easily, whereas on Android, those are fairly standard capabilities for apps. So you find that the monetization techniques in iOS are somewhat different from Android apps, and the risk profile is different. So what we find in iOS is that the riskiest category are games, with about 15% of games posing a significant risk to enterprises, followed by news applications. News applications are trying to monetize user data in any way possible, so they're trying to take as much data as possible from the user, granting very promiscuous permissions, and trying to read and send all that data off the device. And then we find productivity apps, books, and utilities next. In our analysis of over 3 million apps on both platforms, we find that 30% of Android apps can leak users' private data, which is certainly a concern to the consumer user, you and I, but it's also a very great concern to the enterprise. And these apps need to be rated, examined, and controlled, as particularly in BYOD environments or COAP environments. On the iOS side, we find that about 25% of apps can access your contact database. A number of those apps are not just reading your contacts, but they're actually sending them off the device. Now, this becomes a real problem if you are allowing users to connect into Active Directory and be able to look at other users inside your enterprise, because now these apps are mining the entire enterprise Active Directory database and sending that off the device. This exposes companies to targeted advanced persistent threats, spear phishing. There are also quite a number of employee privacy violations and possibly password violations that can come from this type of behavior of apps. Apps need to be rated for what their behaviors are truly, not just what permissions they ask for, where that data is being sent around the world, who that data is being sent to, and whether you can trust the person that data is being sent to. We found about 9% of Android apps are reading the contact databases, and about half of those are sending that data off the device. More disturbingly, 6% of Android apps are reading browser histories, and about half of those are sending them off the device. Now, the browser history is a privacy violation for a consumer. It's letting people know, for example, advertising, targeting, where they go, where they shop, where they work, what they like to do, who's using the phone, where they are. And if you think about that in an enterprise context, now what's been disclosed is who the user is, where they work, are there internal resources on the network, such as, for example, a SharePoint inside the network, or an SAP inside the network, or is that user logging in on a VPN to the company? They know where that user banks, whether that user likes sports, whether they maybe like gardening or travel. So a whole dossier has been created about users and about the company that they work for, which has now been sent off the device. Apps that read and communicate browser history need to be evaluated and carefully controlled in an enterprise context, particularly in BYOD and COAP environments. We did a further analysis where we found that 68% of iOS apps do not have a privacy policy, and about 72% of Android apps don't have one either. If employees or you yourself are using these apps, your data can be sold or publicly leaked and you have no recourse. Assume that any data that those apps access could be published publicly on Pastebin, on a website, published out through, searchable through Google, and you will have absolutely no legal recourse. Now, of the apps that have privacy policies, how many have you read? Are you able to keep up with the privacy policies of all the apps being used by yourself or your employees? What we found is that a company with about 2,000 users will have about 49 to 50,000 apps in their environment, and about 9,000, and in some cases up to 20,000 unique apps in that environment. And these apps are changing constantly. They're being updated. New apps are being downloaded into the environment. These apps could be side-loaded. They could be loaded from legitimate app stores, but provide a real threat into the enterprise. And these need to be managed, controlled in an automated fashion so that you can trust the user devices and allow them into your enterprise. We did a study looking at which countries publish the most malicious apps and high-risk apps. We were expecting, candidly, Eastern Europe, Asia to be the countries, some of the countries that had the highest propensity to publish risky apps. And what we found was interesting. The United States is the country that publishes the most number of risky and malicious apps in the world, at about 42% of the world's concentration and contribution of malicious and privacy leaking apps. China follows at about 17.5%, then followed by India, Korea, Taiwan, Australia, France, and Singapore. The Russian Federation, interestingly, is way down the list there at about 12 or 13. Now, this is the total number of apps that are published that are malicious or highly risky. When you change the graph around and look at percentage of apps in a given country, that could be malicious or highly risky, what you find is that 1 in 8 apps in China are either malicious or highly risky for deployment inside of an enterprise. And you'll find the United States dwindles down to about 10th in the list, where about 1% of apps published in the United States by US publishers are malicious or highly risky. I'm often asked, well, if I have a containerized environment in mobile, I'm secure, right? I don't have to worry about what all the apps on my users' devices are doing in this containerized environment. And my response to that is yes, you are quite secure if all email is containerized, meaning personal email and corporate email are in completely separate containers, separate attachments, separate encryption, separate access control, and that corporate email can be deleted separately from personal email. Calendars must be containerized as well because calendars contain personal information, links to who's going to what meetings. Those need to be also separately containerized, personal calendars and enterprise calendars. Critically, address books must also be containerized. So there has to be a separate address book for the enterprise and a separate address book for personal use, and the enterprise address book must be access controlled and must be severely restricted on which apps can actually talk to that address book. So for example, you can't have a personal email coming in with an attachment about a meeting and then click on it and then post it into your enterprise address book. It must be fully containerized. You also have to ensure that user devices have no Wi-Fi access on your internal corporate networks, because a user could bring in a device and it may have nice enterprise containment, but if they've got an app that is port scanning your network and sending that data to some hostile party, you've now created a big vulnerability inside the network. You've let that user bring in a hostile app into the network. Similarly, you can't allow broad-based VPN access for mobile devices into your network. You must use a tunneling technology, because if you use VPNs, then again, any app can get into your network. Obviously, you have to make sure employees don't reuse passwords, because employees on mobile devices can be tricked in many different ways to expose passwords. You can have in-app phishing, you can have SMS phishing, you can have personal email phishing. All of these things can expose passwords. You can also, on iOS, for example, have hostile profiles that can replace things like iTunes and then trick users into giving out those passwords. And those could retrieve backups of the device. So password reuse must be strictly enforced and controlled. You have to assume there are no malicious apps on the user's devices and that nobody is targeting you. Because if they're targeting you, there are many ways for apps to be placed maliciously on users' devices. And if you don't have a way to monitor what those apps are, what their provenance is, who they're sending data to, and what their data is, then you're really opening yourself up. You're basically blind. Let's give an example of a kill chain, a threat environment for a user innocuously having an app on their device. That app, for example, in this case, it's a communications app that gives you free or cheap phone calls or texting internationally. That app asks for access to contacts and directory information. If that's tied to the corporate network, you've got a real problem. So that app will be getting personal contact information. If it's tied to AD or the person is putting in work contacts into that address book, you've got corporate contacts in there. That employee may have customer contacts in there. You've got corporate contacts in there, especially if it's connected to AD. Even if it's not, the employee may be adding in contacts of people that they talk to regularly, IT security, their managers. You got their personal contacts. They may have customer contacts in there. If it's in a healthcare environment, they may even have patient contacts in there. And believe it or not, some users are silly enough to store passwords and other authentication credentials inside of their contact database. When they run one of these apps, the app will send that address book to servers in another country. In this case, sending to the UK over an insecure network. That could be an insecure HTTP connection. It could be an HTTPS connection, which has a heartbleed vulnerability. That data is often resold to marketers on a global basis. So now, address book information, passwords is being sold to many different companies around the world. And here's an example of common ones that we see companies selling that data to. We also find that many of these app operators replicate the data to global servers. So you're finding that data is now getting pushed out to India, Korea, Singapore, China, Japan, Europe. So now that data has been pushed all over the world. You've got no idea where it's been pushed to. You have no notification. In many cases, if there's not a privacy policy, you have no legal recourse against this republication of your data. Let's say hackers gain access to the data. Now you've got a set of problems. Privacy violations. Let's say the data is published to Pastebin, published out on some website that gets Google indexed. You could have HIPAA violations, security violations, privacy violations. That data can be resold to spammers. The data resold to hackers or used for spear phishing attacks, advanced persistent threats against your own employees and your networks, and if users were silly enough to store passwords in there, direct password breaches into your network. One thing that Marble does is, in addition to examining what apps do, what their behavior is, we look at what is the reputation of the servers, the companies, and the individuals where that data is being sent. We've mapped that across 700,000 publishers of apps and over 3 million apps. So we're able to start to learn not only where's the data going, who's it going to, and what is the data, but should you trust the company or individual where that data is being sent. This is all factored into risk scores, which then allow you to either by hand or automatically make decisions about whether those apps should be on your employees or even customers' devices. Now, I'm often asked about malware, and certainly malware across Android and iOS is so much less prevalent than it is on Windows-based operating systems due to the nature of the security of the operating system. Malware these days is much more about apps and malicious apps and privacy leaking apps and surveillance apps than it is about breaking into the operating system and finding a zero-day flaw as it used to be. Nevertheless, there are malicious types of apps and families. Let's look at some of them on Android, and then we'll look at some of the more dangerous ones on iOS. We find ransomware quite prevalent. These are apps that will, for example, encrypt a mobile device and demand money in order to decrypt it. We will also find ransomware where apps will display illegal content to users and then demand money under the guise of a fake FBI investigation. One of the most prevalent types of Android malware are SMS premium messaging apps. So these are apps that will use the user's SMS text messaging to send messages out at very high prices and drive up costs for the user. And if the enterprise is covering those costs, it costs the enterprise directly. More insidious are brand impersonation apps. So these are apps that will use premium brands, Fortune 500 type companies, fashion brands, banks, pharmaceutical companies, to create fake apps to lure users into divulging credit card information. We found a number of fake banking apps. There are a lot of fake games in the Android platform where people will take a popular game, repackage it, and push it out as as a free app when it was originally a paid app, and they will potentially insert some malicious code in there. Definitely we find jailbreakers and rooters. These are apps that try to jailbreak a root of phone and turn it into a bot. Much more prevalent for side-loaded apps, but those are out there in legitimate stores as well. Aggressive adware is rampant on the Android platform. These are adware components that are compiled in by just innocent developers of games that are trying to make some money, but they compile in these third-party adware libraries that will effectively try to get all the information possible off the device and then find a way to resell it. There's a number of botnets and DDoS agents out there. If we look at by percentage, we definitely find the SMS Trojans are the highest percentage of malware. Generalized Trojans, so banking Trojans and others, are the next highest percentage at 21.5%. Rooters and jailbreakers are around 14%. Adware is similar. And then various backdoor programs that will allow attackers to get access back into the device. And then general category of spyware. Now let's look at iOS vulnerabilities. Interestingly, iOS, Apple has done a very good job about publishing security updates to the operating system. In fact, they do a much better job at being transparent than Google does on Android. So security updates for iOS are available from Apple, and what you can find are all the different updates across the different versions of the operating system. Whereas on Android, that information is only available to licensees of the Android operating system from Google. Now, if we look at iOS malware fixes across versions 8 through 8.1 and its variants to 8.2, what we find are that there were 78 critical security fixes over these versions of the OS. 36 of these were malware fixes to stop apps from running malicious code on the device, from gaining privilege escalation or doing arbitrary code execution. Less than 10 of these critical security fixes were found by Apple. They're being found by third parties. These third parties include, of course, malicious actors. We talked about Google keeping Android security fixes somewhat secret, even though it's an open source project. And the last area we need to look at are iOS enterprise targeted apps. So where on Android we find a plethora of malicious apps, privacy leaking apps, apps that are surveying any enterprise. We also find a ton of side-loaded apps and about 40 or 50 different app stores that are out there that users can easily gain access to. In iOS, it's a much more controlled environment. However, we found a major vulnerability are these iOS enterprise targeted apps. WireLurker was a family of these apps identified by Palo Alto Networks. And this is really highlighting the new era in iOS and OS X malware. And what WireLurker apps do are they exploit the fact that anybody can publish an iOS app and have it downloaded on any device without going through App Store review if it's signed with an enterprise app signing certificate. And those are available for $299 from Apple. So if you sign up as a bogus enterprise and pay them $299, presumably with a stolen credit card, then you're able to sign applications, and if you can trick a user into clicking, yes, I trust you, then that app will get installed on their device. And what Palo Alto Networks found was over 800 of these apps that they had noticed had been distributed and were out there in the wild, and Apple had not noticed them. These are only the ones that we know about. There are many, many, many other of them. These are the way that apps are going to be targeted against enterprises, where only 2, 3, 4, 5 of them will be created. They will be promoted to users inside of the company as security updates, OS updates, and those will be installed on user devices, and they have full permission to do anything on the device. FireEye also uncovered an attack that we call the mask attack. This is an attack where an app can be loaded through an enterprise signed app or uploaded from a device. So it's downloaded onto the user's Macintosh or Windows device, and if they plug in their device over USB, then the app is loaded onto the iPhone or iPad. And the concerning thing is that app can say, for example, it's an existing app. So let's say it's a Gmail app. It can say it's Gmail. It gets on there. It says it's Gmail, and it now has access to Gmail's repository of data stored on the device. So this defeats a lot of containerization programs, certainly defeats sandboxing programs. What Marble's doing is offering a solution for consumers called Privacy Hawk, and more importantly for enterprises called App Hawk, to detect and stop mobile apps that are stealing corporate and personal information. It is app threat intelligence and defense for mobile devices, looking at millions of apps, their behaviors, and their risks to the enterprise in a BYOD or COAP environment. In fact, we find companies are now deploying our product inside of containerized environments because increasingly people are putting apps into containerized environments that were homegrown and need security analysis, or that are third-party apps that the CEO or the VP of marketing are demanding that have to be put into their environment. And companies need to know what those apps are doing with their data, where it's going, how it's being used. Here's an example. Recent customer of ours in the healthcare industry. We found that apps inside of this customer were communicating to 35 different countries. Let's take a look at one of these apps. It's Photify on Android. This app is looking up GPS locations. It's tracking users. It's got code to access user accounts. It's sending data to third-party ad networks. It's pairing to Bluetooth devices. It's accessing the contact database and reading that information and sending it off the device. Reading external storage, writing to external storage. It's gathering information about the phone, the network connections, the Wi-Fi's, and the VPNs, and sending those off the device. It's got non-system compiled libraries, so the app developers included a bunch of libraries in there that are not part of the Android operating system. It's talking to things like Facebook, Twitter, and Dropbox and LinkedIn, and can basically write information as well as read it. And it's sending some data secure and some data insecure. More importantly, this app is sending data to 7 different countries. It's sending data, for example, to the Russian Federation. And it's sending data to a number of different locations inside of China and Korea. This app is basically a surveillance app that's looking at your network, who you are, what you're doing, and spreading that data across the world to folks who are reselling that data or targeting you back for an attack. We recommend apps like that are deleted outside of your environment. They should just be not allowed inside your internal environment. And what Marble does is allow you to not just get that information and look at it in dashboard format and graphical format to highlight risks, but to automate control inside of BYOD and COAP environments. And we do it by integrating into your MDM or your EMM system. So integrating app threat intelligence right into the system with configurable workflows and controls. And that's key to making the system scale so that you as an IT administrator don't have to worry about the 29,000 different apps in your environment, which are growing at 50 to 100 apps per day. You're able to know these are the behaviors that are allowed, these are not, I've got control, and everything's automated. So for example, when AppHawk identifies a dangerous app on an employee device that contravenes your rules and your risk settings, it can alert the user, it can alert IT, tell them that an app has to be deleted. If apps aren't deleted in time, AppHawk can quarantine the device, again, through your MDM or EMM, and say, you don't get access to the internal Wi-Fi network or the VPN until you clean this up. And after 3 or 4 days, maybe we'll turn off your access to enterprise apps as well. But once an employee deletes an app, then corporate services are automatically reinstated, and then you get full reporting of everything that's gone on. We're also very sensitive to privacy at Marble Security. We identify dangerous behaviors on devices, but we give you full control around privacy settings so that in a BYOD environment, you don't have to know what's on an individual employee's device. You just know that that device is safe and secure. Perhaps another user's device has some issues and they need to clean them up and go through the quarantining and notification process. And you don't have to be exposed to what's on users' personal devices, keeping that bond of trust between your employees and yourself. The deep app analysis at Marble Security inside of AppHawk has static analysis, dynamic analysis, and more importantly, behavior analysis for iOS and Android devices. It's looking at not only what apps do, but what data they send, where they send it, when they send it. Maybe it's being sent over time. Maybe, for example, apps are sending data back or mining data 3 weeks after it's been deployed. So we're analyzing all of that with a behavioral analysis system to see how apps are changing their behavior and how they might pose a risk to your company. This technology can also be integrated into end user apps. So for example, mobile banking companies, banks, payment processors can use our APIs to integrate it in at the client level and then get a risk picture across mobile devices about whether, for example, they should be letting users make high-value payments off their devices or whether their devices are infected with something that could be malicious. To learn more, we encourage you to visit our website at marblesecurity.com, or if you'd like, tune into our security podcasts. These are available on iTunes for free. I publish one about once every 3 or 4 weeks, and we look at different aspects of mobile security. Some of them are more technical than others, but we encourage you to take a listen to those and submit your feedback as well. Well, that wraps it up for our overview of App Threat Intelligence and Defense for Mobile Devices by Marble Security. My name's Dave Jevons. I'm the Chief Technology Officer. Please feel free to visit us at marblesecurity.com.